Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp and I'm the Chief Digital Manager of Dataversity. We'd like to thank you for joining this Dataversity webinar, Achieving a Single Source of Truth with BI in Your Enterprise, sponsored today by Metric Insights. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. For questions, we'll be collecting them via the Q&A in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, or if you'd like to tweet, we encourage you to share highlights or questions via Twitter using hashtag Dataversity. And if you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. Just click the chat icon in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen for that feature. And as always, we will send a follow-up email within 2 business days containing links to the slides, the recording of the session, and additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now let me introduce to you our speakers for today, Marius Moscovici and Mike Smitherman. Marius has over 20 years of experience in analytics and data warehousing. Marius is the CEO of Metric Insights, the leading provider of a BI portal that helps organizations organize their BI environments and ensure users are getting the actionable data they need. And Mike has over 15 years of product and marketing experience in the business intelligence industry. Mike helped bring analytic products to market with senior roles as Seagate Software, AIM Technology, T-Leaf, and Good Data. And with that, I will give the floor to Marius to get today's webinar started. Hello and welcome.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much. Before we get started, I just want to make a note. We had Ryan from Adobe who was scheduled to participate in this webinar, and unfortunately, an unexpected emergency occurred, so he's not going to be able to make it. So instead, that's why we have Mike Smitherman here, who's going to help us present some of the customer use cases and examples. So with that said, the agenda for today, we're going to be talking about the quest that organizations go through to attain a single source of truth and some of the obstacles that are encountered along that journey. We're going to focus on some customer examples from to look at challenges that some of our customers have faced and how they have tackled these issues around achieving a single source of truth along with demonstrations. And then we'll wrap up with Q&A. So the single source of truth is critically important, and it's almost obvious why that's the case, but I think it's worth mentioning and talking about for a moment that it is a foundational layer for your entire business intelligence stack, right? No matter how good your data ingestion is, your storage, your visualization, your AI algorithms and predictive learning algorithms, no matter how sophisticated you are in all those other areas, if your users do not trust that they have data that they're going to be able to take action with, they know that when they look at something, it's going to be useful. If those things are not there, then foundationally, the rest of it doesn't matter, right? So that's a very important thing to think about. All those other things are important, but without trust, none of those other things matter. And how do you know if you don't really have the level of trust that you might want? Well, there's some very key indicators that are there. Typically, there's very low usage of BI. And in fact, I would say that while there's other things that might contribute to low usage of BI, the fact that users don't trust that they can get value out of information, they don't trust the information they get out of their BI tools, is probably the single biggest factor that contributes to low usage in BI infrastructures today across all different types of verticals and enterprises. And that low usage, if you experience it, typically then will generate very low ROI for your tools. We've had many of our customers have reviewed, for their BI tool licenses, Tableau, MicroStrategy, Power BI, whatever they're using for BI tools. When they look and see what percentage of their total population for which they've licensed these products actively using them, it's not uncommon to find 50% or less active usage of BI tools. And that's a very key indicator that tells that organization that the level of data trust, the level of belief in the single source of truth and access to key information, that's not happening where it needs to be. So, if you look at your environment and you're seeing very low usage and not getting kind of ROI that you'd expect out of your BI spend, that's one thing you should definitely think about. So, when we think about establishing a single source of truth, one way to think about that is really thinking about it as a dance, right? Where there are two parts that need to work in a synchronous and very coherent way for everything to work. So, of course, we always think about consistent data, right? People think about data quality and making sure that, we've got the right data ingestion process and be able to validate the data and clean it and know that you can actually trust that the data is accurate. But really, that is only one dance partner in the equation, because the other dance partner is how that data is used. It's the usage. And so, for example, let's imagine that you have sales data, and that data is brought in, and it's clean and it's pristine. If you've got financial data, and you've got all this great information in your warehouse, but now when you present that in reporting and you present it in visualizations, if there are 5 different ways in which you're computing gross margin, or 5 different ways in which you're computing attainment, you're not going to generate trust because of the inconsistency in that usage. Or similarly, if there's 4 or 5 different places where you might look at the data, and it's just slightly different ways in which it's getting presented, unless the context for the information is crystal clear to the user, unless any inconsistencies in numbers are clearly outlined, then you're not going to have the level of data trust that you need to have. And so data trust is certainly, data governance is a big part of that equation. So as you think of it, I would posit that given that it is the nature of this problem, that generating a single source of truth is really not a destination, but rather a journey. That it is all about putting yourself in your user's shoes, walking in their journey in terms of thinking about how are they using their analytics, and where are the roadblocks they're encountering, where are the potholes they reach, and how is it that they generate value, and examining and asking everything through the lens of are you making it really easy for people to find the information they need to be able to take action. And so that's really the journey that all of us are on. And we'll, as we go through this presentation, we'll go through some examples of specific problems that some of our customers have encountered in that journey, and then how they thought through those problems and solved them to be able to increase the level of the single source of truth that they have with the metric. So we're going to talk about 4 different examples. Use cases that we're going to be covering, and these are all from real customer use cases. So first of all, we're going to cover a retail company that was just struggling with a huge amount of dashboard overload, just way too many analytics out there, way too many reports, people overwhelmed, not knowing where to find things. Then we're going to talk about a software company that had some data engagement challenges. The analytics were there, but people were not really using them to the extent that they were expecting, and what they found in that and how they addressed those issues. Then we'll talk about a pharmaceutical company that had some data quality issues that eroded the fundamental trust between their BI team and the sales team that was consuming that information. And finally, we're going to talk about a clinical trials company that had to deal with the changes in the COVID-19 landscape and rethink their operational environment and how they use the single source of truth to achieve that within their. So, first example. So this is a Fortune 100 retail company, and they have 70,000 employees, tens of thousands of reports across multiple tools, Tableau, Cognos, other technologies. And when they surveyed what they had in their enterprise, they found that they had 30 different BI portals. Everything from wiki pages to custom-built SharePoint sites to custom web pages that the different groups had built, and so these things are sprouted out up everywhere. And there was just lack of consistency. Some of these portals that they had put together to make the content available had documentation and had good governance, and others just were places where people would just put a lot of content and create links and have people find this content. So there was a huge amount of inconsistency, and depending upon where a consumer of information went, their mileage would vary. Sometimes they would have a great experience, and sometimes they'd have a terrible experience. Furthermore, there was no way to have any kind of discoverability, right? So if you can't ask the question, where is this content, and find it in a single place, there's just no way to be able to overcome this dashboard overload and get to the content that's really needed. So what did they do? Well, they went through an initiative where they pulled all those portals and combined it into a single centralized portal. Now, of course, in an organization of that is that large, you cannot create a single source of truth portal and have every single, all that content being built by one group. You've got, literally dozens of different BI teams adding this content. So what they did is they deployed a hub and spoke model where there was a center of excellence that managed the general governance rules for the portal. And then they distributed the actual publishing and governing of that content, the deciding what content gets put in place, what documentation gets published with that. All of those decisions were decentralized to the BI teams that work with those particular groups. So that enabled certification to be applied, so that thereby all of the content that was in there was certified when it was appropriate with a consistent set of rules, and yet it was being certified by the folks in the BI organization that knew that content and knew what needed to be done. And then furthermore, there was an ability to enable discoverability, so that you could actually make it possible for users to say, let me find something, maybe even something I don't have access to. Now, I might not be able to get to the content, but I might be able to search, discover that there's something I don't have access to, and then request access to that, and not have to go to several dozen places to find it. It's all in one place. So with that, Mike is going to show you kind of an example of how this kind of a solution looks.
Yeah, thanks, Marius. So as we go through these use cases, I'm going to basically give you a demonstration of sort of how this is being achieved in the Metric Insights platform. But as I go through these, sort of think beyond our particular platform here, think about sort of the approach that these customers were taking and how you might apply that in your environment, regardless of sort of the technology that you might be using. So let's talk about this concept of, I guess, essentially a consolidated portal for business intelligence in your organization. And yeah, that's exactly what this particular customer was trying to achieve. And there's really a number of components. So what you're looking at here is again, the Metric Insights portal, but essentially, what you need to do is be able to connect to any source of business intelligence within your environment. And that is obviously any BI platforms that you might have, but it's also reporting that might exist in different operational systems. Every tool has its own reporting. It could be documents, it could be spreadsheets. In order to provide a consolidated portal, you need to essentially give access to any source of BI. And so what you're looking at here is an example of the Metric Insights portal connected to a bunch of different tools. So BI tools like Tableau and Power BI, but also data coming from databases that we want to visualize directly, PDFs, spreadsheets, and each of these tiles that you're seeing here is essentially a piece of content, excuse me, that's being published from one of those systems and shows a particular asset or a particular piece of data on there. And to the user, they shouldn't have to care where these pieces of content came from. And what they've enabled is the ability to drill into a particular asset, to be able to see a preview of what that particular piece of content looks like with the relevant metadata that is collected around that. So what's it called? When was it updated? Who owns it? And have the ability to be able to drill into that content and essentially embed it in this single portal for users. So in this case, I'm accessing Tableau. I didn't necessarily need to know that this was a Tableau dashboard or that it existed in a particular Tableau site somewhere. I'm just accessing it and I get the full functionality that I would expect in that particular tool, whatever it might be. And the reason that they are also embedding this within a single portal for their users is they're able to wrap some consistent functionality around this content for those users. So every tool, every BI tool has a slightly different way of doing things like subscriptions or bookmarking or collaboration if they have that functionality at all. Well, what they're able to do with the portal is embed the content, but then wrap things around it. So things like the ability to bookmark data or pre-filter data for a user, the ability to add documentation to the content, things like release notes or definitions, the ability to subscribe and share content, we'll look at that later, and things like the ability to enable user collaboration so users can start to have a discussion around that content. And so whether I'm looking at Tableau or Power BI or Business Objects, whatever it might be, as a user I can access that and get a consistent experience. So if we go back to the main screen here, again, we can do that for all the BI tools. They're also pulling data into their portal, this particular customer. And we'll look at some examples of this in more detail when we touch on some other use cases. But doing things like bubbling up metric tiles for their users so that we can give users leading indicators of what's changing in the data and where they might want to focus their attention, and these tiles with the numbers on represent that. And again, as I mentioned, the ability to have sort of documentation, spreadsheets, whatever it might be. And so what they're doing is taking that content, they're organizing it down the left-hand side here in a consistent hierarchy that makes sense for their business. So think of this as sort of the file structure for your BI content. Overcoming the challenge that each of these individual tools organizes stuff in different ways. And as a user, I have to remember what folders exist and what tools to be able to find anything. And essentially provide this environment where users can come in and obviously browse through the categories and content, but also search for content that they're interested in. And in our case, we do some natural language processing against search terms. We recommend common search terms that people are looking for and allow you to search for content across that essentially catalog of information to bring back a ranked set of results for the users. And so it's very easy for me to go and find things that I might be interested in with, again, not having to know where that content necessarily exists. Now, the other key piece of this for this customer and any customer really is understanding as well that different users are interested in different pieces of content. And obviously there's a whole permissions and security piece to any portal and any BI system. And so what we need to do is make sure that as different users are accessing the portal, we're creating a very curated experience for them with that content. And so I'm just going to link across to another browser window here where I'm logged in as a different user, Avery. We need to make sure that she's getting the experience that she needs in terms of the content and functionality that she has access to. So you'll immediately see that based on her permissions, she gets access to a subset of the categories based on her role, a subset of the tiles based on her role. And even if she drills into a particular piece of content, like that Tableau dashboard we looked at, it may be that we want to pre-filter content to that particular user based on, again, their role and where they sit. So if Marius is responsible for one region, I'm responsible for another, we can have that mapping that pre-filters the content if that country filter, for example, exists within a particular dashboard. So again, removing that need to have to slice and dice and drill down into the data, or if, again, you have a couple of minutes to consume this stuff every day. The final piece that I'll touch on in this use case is around the sort of discoverability aspect that Marius mentioned as well. So as I search as a user through this content, typically I'm searching through the content I have access to, but also they choose to make some content what we call discoverable. An example here is these tiles that have the padlock on and where the image is blurred out. This is content that, as a user, I actually don't have the permissions to see right now, but because it was made discoverable, if I search and this pops up in my search results, or if in this case, I'm looking at it because new content's been added to the portal and I'm seeing that. This is stuff that, again, I don't have access to, but I'm now aware that there's these procurement dashboards out there, and actually, this is something that's interesting to me. I may want to go and request access to that particular tile, and you can tie a workflow to that. In this particular customer's case, it opens a ticket to request access for that user and enable access for them so they can access it moving forward. So again, the overriding goal with this use case was make sure users have access to one place to see all their BI and make it as relevant and searchable as possible. So let's jump back to the slides here and hand it back to you.
Yeah, so thanks, Mike. So just to sort of recap what they were able to do through basically creating this portal that gives access to the single source of truth. That's where all the analytics were published across the enterprise, and deploying that sort of one group at a time, rolling it out across the entire organization. They were able to establish a consistent governance model for all of their BI while still maintaining a distributed model for actually publishing of content. They were able to identify that single source of truth. Through everyone knew exactly where they need to go, get the content, always the same place. And there's always a consistent standard around documentation, change management, all those aspects of governance, and there's the ability to then discover the content. And finally, maybe even most importantly, because of the certification capabilities, because of those abilities to say that something is certified and have users see who certified it, there is now accountability around that particular piece of content that I'm looking at. I know when I'm looking at a report that it was certified by Joe, and I'm holding him accountable if there's a problem. If there's an issue, I know who to reach out to if I'm seeing anything wrong. So that generates a whole lot more trust in the analytics. So shifting gears, another company, and this is a Fortune 400 software company, encountered a different issue. They were seeing that low engagement that I talked about before, where just a very low percentage of the users that were actually actively using the BI assets that were created, even though a lot of effort was being put into creating reporting. And so, they really analyzed that, and they took a look and said, why is that happening? Surveyed the customers, surveyed the internal stakeholders, et cetera. And they found when they looked at it that decision makers were just not consuming BI for a number of reasons. One, they were very busy. So they were telling them, look, I only have a few minutes a day, and it just takes me too long to find the right analytic. Yes, there's a dashboard out there, but I've got to log on, I've got to search for it, and sometimes there's things that are in the way, and I'm not sure which one to look for. And then I've got to, once I do, oftentimes my information that I need as a stakeholder is in multiple dashboards. So now I've got to go and switch between dashboards, find the next dashboard, search for that. And maybe if there's 3 or 4 dashboards, that's a whole lot of looking that I need to do. And as their users were telling them, oftentimes in a day, they were so busy that they would just simply never think to do that. And they would just make the decisions without that information. And so obviously that means that the BI investment, the ROI they're generating on all that reporting is way too low. So what did they do? Well, they changed the paradigm so that rather than making the users search through a whole lot of content, with much of that content being irrelevant, right? I mean, all of us, if we go into our BI infrastructures, you probably find one good report for every 5 or 6 or 7 old, obsolete or duplicate piece of content. Right? It's very common to have lots of cruft that's built up in your enterprise. So instead of making them search through all that junk to find that piece of content that's useful, they had the analysts determine for each area what are the most critical pieces of content that particular executives or particular teams needed to see to make to take action. And then they generated digests that were automatically distributed to these users every day, so that in the morning they would just open these digests and take a look and see all the visualizations that were there in one place without having to go anywhere. And then if that visualization said something interesting, they could then click on it and immediately go to that dashboard and do further analysis. And then the final pillar of that solution was that they defined the top tier items, the most important truths, the things that you want to be alerted about, things that you want to be notified when something's going south. And automatically push that to users when the data indicated that an action needed to be taken. right? So now the users, all they had to do was look at an email every morning to be up to speed. And even if they didn't look at that email, if there wasn't a fundamental issue that required their attention, they knew that they would get an email notification or a phone alert train notification or an SMS, whatever, however it is they prefer to receive that information delivered to them so that they could take action. Mike will show you a little more about how that works.
Yeah, so let's look at a few examples of that. And when they look at distribution, there's really sort of two paradigms that they worked around. The first is what Marius was talking about, so making sure that we are setting up the content to go out to users in as relevant a format as possible, whether, again, we'll look at some digests, we'll also look at some alert type examples. There's also a self-service component with this customer as well, where users themselves can choose what they subscribe to, again, across the different tools and types of content that are out there. So we'll look at those two examples. But the first is simply, being able to, and this isn't new in the BI world, but doing it across these different sources is perhaps challenging for some companies, but the ability to schedule distributions to go out to users. And so in their environment, it's the ability to take these tiles that we were looking at before, drag them into a particular folder that logically groups content from different systems, or different metrics and content from different systems into a single folder that they can share within the portal with users, so around a particular use case, for example. But it's a folder that they can include in what we call a burst, but think of it as a distribution, an email in this case, that combines that content from the different sources, goes out on a particular schedule or trigger. And this is showing a pretty simplistic example where we're sending it out on a schedule, but in fact, in their environment, there's a lot going on with these triggers. So the ability to check that the data is updated before you send it out, right? The first thing that loses trust is if you send out stale data or it hasn't changed or updated. So behind the scenes, there's a triggering mechanism going on. It's saying, okay, you send this out at 7 o'clock on weekdays, but only once the data is updated. Let's make sure it's accurate first. So they send it on a schedule. In their case, it goes out to email, but there's other options. For example, sending it to other systems like your collaboration tools, for example, Slack or Teams. They give a very customized experience for their organization, so they can customize these email templates and the message that goes out with this content. But then, again, subscribe users to this content. And so I can pick and choose who starts receiving this. And what's important is if we go across to some example emails here, is what it's going to do is essentially pick up the content that was in that burst, understand who's been subscribed to it, check that the content is all updated before it sends it out, and then actually pre-filter the content for each user. So we looked at that sort of country example, a simplistic example, but if different users are responsible for different regions, I don't want to have to necessarily create individual emails for every user. The system is automatically going to say, okay, there's a dashboard in here that is filtered by country because I'm receiving it and I'm responsible for the US. I'm going to see the pre-filtered version of that dashboard image that we collect. And so in one email, I get access to all the content I'm interested in. I can do things like attach that as also PowerPoints or PDFs. But as Marius said, if there's something here that grabs my attention because something interesting has happened, I can click on this and go back into it and carry out further analysis. So that sort of scheduled distribution of content is important. Marius mentioned, and we'll look at this in a little bit more detail in the next use case, but the ability to sort of notify people the moment something happens in the data as well. So rather than pushing it out on a schedule, actually looking at the data behind these dashboards and saying, okay, there's some unusual events happening or there's some unusual outliers in the data that are critical enough that actually we want to send an alert when that happens and make sure that people are seeing it and acknowledging that they've seen it. And again, if I'm responsible for this region, that's why I received this particular alert, and I can drill into it and take action. So that's kind of pushing content to users on behalf of them. The other sort of model for this is the ability to say, okay, as a user accessing this portal, there's a lot of content that I've got access to here, but I can start dragging tiles into a personal favorites folder. And so there's probably a subset of this content at any point in time is what I'm particularly interested in. And so by creating a personal favorites folder and subscribing to that, I can start to receive digest emails that I've actually curated for myself. So an example here, where it's going to take a look at the tiles every day that I have in my favorites. It's going to say, okay, what's changed in there in terms of, metrics that might have moved a lot, or metrics that might have generated high or low values compared to usual, and any dashboards that are updated. So rather than send me all these dashboards every day, just send me the ones that are updated since I last received the digest, again, pre-filtered to my particular view of the world. And so in this case, I can get a very personalized view of the content that I'm particularly interested in and make sure that, again, I'm on top of all that stuff. And then the final piece for this customer, and I think all of these use cases that is critical that we'll touch on now, is not just sending out this content and making it available through the portal, but also understanding how it's being used and what content is useful to people. So all of our customers are tracking essentially an engagement number for each of the assets that they're either sending out via email or publishing through the portal, to understand, what is being used across the different user groups and categories and data sources, what's becoming more popular, what's decreasing in popularity, what's going unused because perhaps people don't know about it, or it's become stale. In one place, get a very good view of what content is actually being useful to your users, down to a pretty detailed level as well. So being able to look at engagement patterns where I've picked a particular dashboard here in the middle. These are the users who are coming in over a 60-day period and looking at this content. Obviously, the users that are sort of popping in and out are coming in on a regular cadence. The users that are sort of drifting to the outside looked at it once but never came in again and looked at it. So why was that? And so by understanding these engagement patterns, they can make sure that the content that they're sending out is useful, that they're promoting content that isn't being used, or if stuff's run its course, they're retiring that and not cluttering the portal or what they're pushing out to people.
Thanks, Mike. So in this particular case study, by changing the paradigm from purely a go out and get the data to a push paradigm as well, this particular customer was able to get all the key certified analytics into the hands of users in a way that they can consume it in less than a minute every day, just in a single email. They reduced the search time for these users to 0, and the likelihood that these users would look at something that is not part of the single source of truth, that's something obsolete or old, again, to close to 0, because they only push the analytics that were actually meaningful. And then through alerting, they made sure that nobody was missing things that were critical in the data, and that actions were being taken on those most important KPIs that really do require immediate action, where it's hard to make that happen, because unless you happen to check the dashboard on a day in which that particular metric went south, you might not know that happened. So they took care of that eventuality. And that it significantly increased the user engagement with analytics in the enterprise. So for the next case study, we have a pharmaceutical company. And here it's really a data quality issue that we're working with. And if any of you are in the pharmaceuticals industry, you know that your sales reps sort of live and die by their ability to generate market share for their drugs within their particular territories that they're working with. And the way that pharma companies typically deal with that is that they'll bring in data from IMS or other third-party sources, and then that data tells management how their drugs are performing in a particular region as compared to competitive drugs for the same condition. And reps talk about important data. This is data that is being used to compensate the sales reps. So, the fact that having trust in that data is absolutely paramount. If that data is being translated into what you're taking home in terms of a paycheck every week. So in this particular case, what they were finding is that, from time to time, there were some data collection issues through the third-party vendor they were using. And, maybe a particular pharmacy didn't report the full data, or there was some issue with the collection mechanism. And as a result, they would understate the performance of a rep in a region. And that rep would get underpaid, and maybe a month or two later, the corrected numbers would come in, and then they would have to adjust that rep's compensation. And that just generated a tremendous lack of trust. Right, where reps just felt like, well, I don't know, how do I know I can trust this data? How do I know that this number that you're telling me that I'm not performing well here, is that really that I'm not performing well, or is it a problem that, hey, the data collection's wrong, and 2 months from now you're going to tell me everything's okay? And so that meant, data trust, people were not paying attention to the data when they were not taking action in some situations when they needed to. So what did they do? Well, they basically looked at performing statistical analysis of the data that they brought in from the third-party vendor, and having a mechanism by which the analysts were alerted in advance for any anomalies, any situation where things just looked a little bit out of whack. And then the analysts would be able to investigate that and identify the underlying issue. If it's in fact a data issue, they could oftentimes, by reaching out to the third-party vendor, identify that and then proactively flag that, thereby telling the rep, hey, this particular territory, you're showing a low number, but FYI, that's a data quality issue and it's going to be corrected. Or if it looks like it's not a data quality issue because the third party indicated that the data was collected was fine, then they could, with confidence, tell the rep, look, you've got to take care of this because this is real data. So Mike is going to show you a little bit about how that's done.
Yeah, so to put in context again, what's happening here is, jump across to a different browser here. So as Marius said, what's actually happening here is they're getting this data from a third-party source. So they have very little control over the data capture piece of this. And what they're receiving, to put it in simple terms, it's a little bit more complex than this, but they're essentially getting a file every month which states on a rolling, I think it's 3-month period, that the volume of prescriptions that are being written for each of the drugs. So every month they get the last 3 months and it rolls forward. And as Marius said, they're using this to basically run operations across the business, so sales and manufacturing, that sort of thing. And so what they've done is look at it from two perspectives, sort of a pure data quality perspective, but also from sort of a business metric perspective to say, okay, are there any sort of anomalies within our business metrics that might be sort of an early indicator or an early warning that something is going on here? So let's look at some examples. So what they have is, and I mentioned this at the beginning, this concept of metric tiles. And in this case, one of the business metrics that they're tracking is this concept of just pure volume of drugs and prescriptions. So the number of prescriptions that are getting written by all the different pharmacies and doctors that could be prescribing. And over time, they build up, obviously, a time series of this data, but, there's a lot of different, dimensionality to this data. So what they do is they basically automate the process of running a basic statistical time series analysis against this data to say, are there any statistical outliers that are occurring? And to Marius's point, when there's a low or a high in the data, they're basically saying this could be one or two things. One is, it's a business issue, and the sales rep needs to get onto this particular account and educate them or see what's going on. The other is, it could be an indicator that something went wrong with the feed. So to Marius's point, when we spot these statistical anomalies, an alert actually goes out to sales ops to say, hey, you may want to go and look into this and figure out what's going on before we tell the rep and get them focused on what they need to look at. So that's kind of using these business indicators as the leading indicators. They're also able to automate the process of essentially analyzing these files of data that come in, and this is very specific to this particular use case, but taking two files and two snapshots of overlapping months and saying, okay, how does one compare with the other? Did volumes change significantly between the two files for effectively the same date? Because in the first one, some of the pharmacies were late in reporting. And okay, I saw that dip on this particular date, but we're probably catching up, and it's not an issue with the account. Or if for some reason we dropped data in a particular load for a particular reason. So they're able to automate the process of comparing these snapshots and looking for exceptions in the data that might be an indicator that absolutely it's not the rep's fault here, and something's gone on. And we need to sort out the data and solve that before we sort of worry the rep with it. So using a combination of sort of pure data quality, looking at the data, automating exceptions, and also using those business indicators as the leading indicators. Again, they're trying to get ahead of the curve with what's going on, and trying to gain trust again with the sales reps.
So basically then with this solution, by implementing this mechanism that I just described, they were able to achieve a high level of confidence in the data, right? This fundamentally really changed the relationship between the BI team and the sales team. That was one of the big accomplishments here, is that now they were partners, and the sales team felt like the BI team wasn't just giving them data, but they were actively investigating and being proactive about things and letting them know why things didn't look right. And then this higher level of data quality fundamentally improved morale. So I think that was a big win overall for the organization. The fourth case study we want to talk about is the clinical trials company. So this is a company that does the clinical trials for drugs for almost all the pharmaceuticals in the world. They run those trials for them. And, as you can imagine, I'm sure your business was heavily impacted by COVID-19, and there are a lot of changes that you had to make. But if you put yourself in the shoes of a company that runs clinical trials, you can imagine COVID-19 had a massive impact on that. These clinical trials are high-touch operations. You need to get the patient into the doctor's office. You need to administer the drug. You need to interview them. You need to, so there's a lot of interaction there. And all of a sudden, everything's going, different geographies are going into different levels of shutdown. In some places, people can't even go to doctor's offices. Other places, there's different regulations around the interaction. So they had to really rethink how they did all their operations to be able to shift and be nimble and be able to continue the work on all these vital clinical trials that they had started in the post-COVID world in this new COVID reality. So it was critical for them to do that. They needed to make sure that everyone in their organization was on the same page around their critical KPIs and metrics. So they had the necessary tools out there. They had a number of different reports, and they were building rapidly some new reports from new data sources, sometimes things that were previously being automatically collected and needed to be manual collection. So they had to be very nimble in this ability to quickly roll up all of the different analytics they currently had in a way that was a top-down, very clear for the management to understand what's going on, and then quickly integrate and plug in new analytics as they develop the new KPIs. And then use that top-level number from a simple perspective, have the user know immediately, is it good, is it not good? If it's not good, give them a drill path directly to the dashboard or analytic or visualization that will give them the information on what action needs to be taken.
Let's take a look at that. If I come back to the main screen here. So what we're really talking about here is being agile in terms of what metrics and reports you make available to people. So as Marius said, the challenge was not that the data did not exist. It's really that the priorities for how they were measuring the business were changing and continue to change as the environment changes, and making sure that we're not relying on the user to be able to find the dashboards that have the metrics for those new priorities in them. And so, how that translates into the platform is that they're able to take different elements from that catalog that we were just looking at, so the different dashboards and metrics, bubble those up into very curated, summarized views for their management team. So, example here where they're essentially looking across all areas of the business, being able to take metrics out of the dashboards that already exist, apply some of that analysis that we were looking at in the last use case to provide these sort of high-level numbers to the management team with the appropriate sort of color coding and anomaly detection to tell them that something has happened or not. And so provide that in a single pane for their management, be able to change these metrics behind the scenes if that's what's required with the current environment, but also enable management, if they do see something with a particular metric, to be able to drill into that, either into the KPI or into the underlying, in this case, back to our Tableau dashboard that we've been looking at in the example. So that's really, kind of one example of how you might mash up content, but this kind of expands beyond sort of this particular customer use case. Really, this applies to any type of user in the organization who's maybe going to think about data for a few minutes every day before they get on with their job, even though they have this catalog, even though that you're pushing stuff out to them via email. What is the common content that you might want to curate for a user regardless of source? And so the ability to create sort of these mashups of content that pull metrics that a particular user is interested in, pre-filtered to their world, to be able to manage by exceptions rather than showing everything all the time, and being able to embed content that is relevant, that they look at all the time, regardless of where it may have come from, Tableau, Power BI, onto a single page that they can very easily consume that content, that ultimately you can change the source of it behind the scenes without affecting, the user experience. If we migrate from Tableau to another system, we should still be providing this content because it's still useful. The user should be shielded from that, and you can create a very curated experience for them.
So the net results for this organization of basically creating this single pane of glass where you have all of their most important KPIs for a user, where Surface is very simple, easy way to understand format with the ability to drill down to details, was that you generated that single source of truth. There was no question about where the most important KPIs are. They were there for them to click through in that one place where they needed to look. There was a lot of agility that was generated because it was easy to swap in KPIs as the business required that. So that's a big advantage. And the management's then able to really focus on what's most important and not spend a lot of time on wasting time, which increases trust. So to kind of wrap up, there were some common themes that went through all of these different case studies that we discussed today. One of them is data quality, right? And I think here we need to all understand that your data is not going to be 100% accurate 100% of the time. It can't be. No one ever has that. So what you need to do is think about data quality in a way where you say, well, how do I increase trust in my data by making sure that I know when I have quality issues, and as a BI team, I'm proactive in notifying my users that those things exist, so that they are not coming to me telling me that there's an issue. I'm coming to them telling them that, hey, there's a problem, I'm working on it, it's going to get resolved. That's very important. Second is content needs to be organized and discoverable. So you have to have a mechanism by which you take the information that is relevant to users and present it to them in a way that they do not have to keep on bumping into things that are not relevant or duplicative or obsolete, but instead are really only the content that's relevant to them is there, and it's organized in a way that they can easily discover and get to it. Third, certification is absolutely essential to generating trustworthiness. So if a user knows not only that a piece of content is certified, but who they can hold accountable for that certification. There's a process and a governance model around that certification. That fundamentally, dramatically increases the level of trust that the user will have in that content, because there's a person standing behind that visualization that they know they can trust. And then focus the anomaly and exception detection. So we talked about that before, making sure that you get the users and have them pay attention on those analytics that require their attention. And then finally, distribution, right? So the assumption that it should not be that users are going to be able to go in every day and have time to go find a particularly useful dashboard. Instead, push the most useful content to them.
So I think with that, we've left about 10 minutes here. I see some questions coming in, Shannon. We're going to field those to us, but please enter your questions in the Q&A window, and we'll start going through those.
Thank you, Marius, and thank you, Mike, for this presentation. And just to answer the most commonly asked questions, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email to all registrants by end of day Thursday for this webinar with links to the slides and links to the recording of the session along with anything else requested. So diving in here, how do you manage authentication, authorization to all the source BI systems from the portal?
Yeah, that's a great question. And obviously, what you don't want to do is have to create a portal that does not have a good authentication model, because that doesn't work. And nor do you want to duplicate your authentication model and build in the portal, because that's a huge amount of work. So what we do is we synchronize with the customer's existing LDAP or Active Directory system. And we inherit, essentially, then by doing so, we inherit the permissions model that is driving all the underlying BI tools. So typically, there's LDAP groups or Active Directory groups that define certain areas of content within the BI tools. We connect and read those same LDAP groups and sync them up to that same content within the Metric Insights portal, thereby knowing what can be presented to users. And then we allow for content to be classified as discoverable, which allows them to be shown to users with those lock icons that Mike showed. In the event that it's not accessible to them through the security model, but has been deemed to be discoverable.
And then purely from an authentication perspective, Marius just mentioned this, but single sign-on to those tools as well, so when they drill through.
Yes, that's right. So using SAML, you typically, or whatever single sign-on system you already have, we connect to that as well, so that you don't need a second login to be able to connect. And then we can immediately know if something is available to users or not.
So do users still have access to the original platforms directly? For example, the Tableau interface you were showing. If so, how does that affect your usage tracking?
Yeah, so I think in general, customers are trying to enforce a sort of go through the portal. This is where you access your content, but you're absolutely right. In some cases, users then, if they find a piece of useful content, they may bookmark that directly within the tool and start accessing it there. In regards to how that affects usage tracking, so in our platform, we're actually able to pick up the usage stats directly from a lot of these underlying tools that we have plugins for, certainly all the BI tools, where they're capturing their own usage stats in those tools. And so we're able to sort of marry that up with what's being accessed within the portal as well, which in itself is interesting statistics, right? You can see then not only sort of what's the overall view for a particular number of views for a particular piece of content, but who viewed it directly within the tool versus access it through the portal versus consumed it through an email, for example.
And for data quality issues, what is the best way and best practice of notifying users that we know there's an issue?
So I think there are different mechanisms that you use. So I think Mike showed that that you kind of want a belt and suspenders approach. So you certainly want in the portal itself to have a way to generate a message that's very clear, whether they're coming to that content or they're just opening up their homepage and they're seeing the things that tell them, hey, this Tableau, Tableau's got issues today, we're working on it, or there's an underlying data pipelining issue, these things are affected, and you want to make sure that that is targeted. So, when you set up an announcement, we call those announcements in Metric Insights, when you set those up, you actually target the analytics that are affected. So you can say, I've got this announcement that is going to hit these particular dashboards because they're using this underlying data source, right? So you can do that. You can do that manually. You can do it in an automated fashion and just generate those announcements when you encounter a data quality issue. Various ways to do that. But that's one approach. And then the second approach is really to just do it through notifications, through the push capabilities we talked about. There's some classes of data where you still have to push the data. You can't because it might take a long time to deal with the data quality, but people still need to use it. So in that case, then just having the data, but then also as soon as that data has been consumed, sending an exception list and saying here is a list of areas where we think there's anomalies. From a statistical perspective, can be very useful, can be very informative. Of course, if you can have analysts review that first and digest it and then provide it to the users in a more consumable fashion, that's great. In some cases, because of timing requirements, you can't afford to do that. In that case, at least give your users a sense of, in the data that I care about, here's the list of anomalies. Here's where there's something going on. Either it's data quality or maybe it's real in the data, but something in business. But this is what you need to look at.
And what is the average length to implement from initial review through use cases set up, then PRD deployment?
No, the length for doing
implementation.
For an implementation.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it varies on the scale of the implementation, in the sense that, if you're deploying to 70,000 users, you're going to do that rollout over, maybe a year, right? If you're going to be doing that, you have multiple groups. But if you look at the initial implementation, if you imagine that, which is typically, we recommend not a boil the ocean approach, even if you have many thousands of users, we recommend take one particular user group and deploy there, and then rinse repeat. And that way, that also allows the center of excellence to be built up and to be able to start engaging the rest of the organization. So if you take that kind of model where you do a incremental approach, typically I'd say from the time you've got the system implemented, 60 to 90 days, you can have that first pilot group up and running. That's typical. We've had scenarios where it's as short as a week, just where people just knew exactly what they wanted. They were really prepared. They did a POC, and even during the POC, they have really prepared. Sometimes it might take a little bit longer, but a 60 to 90-day cycle is typical for an initial rollout. With then incremental rollouts, it can happen then every 30 days after that. So you can onboard new groups, add additional use cases, and so forth.
Yeah, and I would say it's driven a lot by understanding some of that usage that we spoke about in terms of your BI assets, right? So if you're going to roll out a portal, the last thing you want to do is move any sort of a mess from where it is today into a new portal and publish that. So a lot of implementation, quote unquote, is about understanding what we want to push out to users, what is useful. Understanding engagement that you have today with each of the assets before you then say, okay, let's make sure we're publishing those so it's easy to find for everyone else in the organization and go from there.
Yes, as well as processes. A lot. I mean, that's true what Mike said. It's not about the technology so much as it is a lot about the process of figuring out what constitutes certification, how to make certification happen, what's the tagging and categorization, what's involved in that, what kind of documentation standards, if any, you want to have for things that are published in the portal. So thinking through all those general BI governance questions is really part of this implementation, because the technology is only as useful as the underlying rules that you put in place and the fit of those rules to your organization.
Yeah, and I'm going to steal the next question here as well, Shannon, because I think it's related to this. Sounds like you need a lot of, just disappeared. Where was it? Sounds like you need a lot of people to manage all this once it's been deployed. Can you give an example of how many people? Marius, maybe you want to talk about sort of the distribution, the content publication, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it varies quite very somewhat, but typically does not require a lot of people to administer the solution by itself because it is a distributed, you tend to do it as a distributed operation. So typically you have a center of excellence, which is maybe one person working on metric insights, maybe somebody on if it's a very large organization, it might be a handful of people that are responsible for, you have various roles such as, training of people in the organization, the ability to do administrative instance, of course, and then overall product management internally within the organization, what team needs to go next and how do you onboard them, etc. So, but that is typically no more than a team of 3, even in a very large organizations, tens of thousands of users. And in smaller organizations or organizations that have 1,000 or fewer users, that can even be a person or even a part-time person. And then what you're doing is you're leveraging the rest of the organization. Of course, the BI tool analysts are going to be responsible for publishing their content. You're just really educating them and then using a force multiplier to engage them into. So
it's often quite a distributed publication process, as Marius said. So different groups across the organization are responsible for publishing their content into the portal with a set of guidelines and rules from that central group.
Exactly, and that it doesn't add any resource requirements because they have to publish their content in some way anyway. They're just following a more governed, standardized approach.
Well, Marius and Mike, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm afraid that is all the time we have for today. Again, just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email to all registrants by end of day Thursday for this webinar with links to the slides and links to the recording. Thank you all to all of our attendees for being so engaged in everything we do. I just appreciate it as always. Again, Mike and Marius, thank you so much. Thanks to Metric Insights for sponsoring today. I hope everybody has a great day and stay safe out there. Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.